Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome everyone to today's Environment Committee meeting. Members of the public may like to follow @London Assembly on X and use the hashtag #AssemblyEnvironment for this meeting. May I please remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Members and guests are also reminded to position their microphones so they can be heard clearly. If you need to move your microphone, please do so by picking it up from the base. The main item for discussion today is building action on net zero. Before we begin, we have a few items items of business to attend to, can I now ask our committee officer, Sal Fazal, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies have been received.
Thank you very much. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare?
No interest.
Thank you. Minutes. Can I ask the committee to note that we received some minor clarifications from invited guests after the publication of the agenda papers for this committee meeting. The revised transcript has been republished as a draft on the website. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of a meeting held on 16th of October 2024 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from its previous meetings? Thank you. Response to committee output. Can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor of London to its letter on food security and sustainability as attached at Appendix 1 of the agenda report?
Noted.
Thank you. Now to today's main item of business. Thank you for your patience. This is a discussion of building action on net zero. Today's discussion will be split into 2 panels. I'd like to welcome our guests for the first panel. I'm joined by Dr. James Richardson, Acting CEO of Climate Change Committee, and Razan McMillan, Associate Director of Cities, States and Regions, Partnerships and UK, Middle East and Africa Lead, CPD. It's a great title. James, if I begin with you. So the report that the Committee on Climate Change released this year in July stated the UK is not on track to hit its milestones for net zero by 2050. Can I ask, in your opinion, does responsibility lie mainly with national government, or is this about regional and local government?
So I think most of the responsibility lies with the national governments, not just the UK, but the devolved administrations as well. But I think, across the whole of net zero, really, we need not only central government and local government, but also business and individuals to act, each in their own way, in accordance with the things that they control. So I think ideally we get there through a kind of broad partnership with everybody doing the things that they are best placed to do.
Thank you very much. Razan, if I can turn to you. So the Skidmore report talked about giving extra support or additional backing to so-called trailblazer cities with the aim of accelerating action on net zero. What's your view of further devolution of powers and funding to cities like London? Just while Razan finds her notes, James, I'm going to ask you the same question anyway, so should I jump to you and give Razan a moment on that?
Sure. I mean, as an institution, the CCC wouldn't take a view on the exact balance of powers between central and local government, but I think clearly there are areas where the problem is inherently a local one, and therefore a locally driven solution is likely to be most successful, however the precise governance and funding of that works. So if I think of something like energy efficiency in buildings, it's an inherently local issue, and particularly if you want to target people who, say, have very high gas usage or who are in fuel poverty, the knowledge about who those people are, what the circumstances of their housing are, those are local issues, and therefore local government needs to have a key role in that. Or something like planning for electric vehicle charge points. Where do you best place these? How do you interact with the electricity supplier? These are quite geographically specific issues for a particular area. So there are definitely parts of the overall net zero transition where I would say a strong role for local government would help us move forward faster.
Thank you. And Razan, if I can come to you.
Thanks, and apologies, Zach, I was trying to find my notes. So yes, just to echo James's comments, as decision makers and service deliverers in their local communities, cities have this crucial role to play, and a lack of appropriate powers is one of the barriers to net zero and other environmental targets that is often cited by UK local authorities responding to our CDP questionnaire. I would add that lack of funding is also commonly cited. So in 2023, 60% of authorities reported that budgetary capacity is the most challenging factor in addressing the effects of climate change. So as well as kind of more powers and more funding, it's crucial to join up action between different actors and levels of local government to support this long-term planning and investment and ensure the continued prioritisation of climate action and avoid disparities in the level of action taken across the country. And to support this engagement, we would stress that transparency through regular reporting and communication allows those city governments to demonstrate progress and build trust with local partners, whether that's national government, the public, and really strengthen accountability.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. You may not feel able to answer this, but I just wondered if you think that political alignment across the different levels of government, between local government, regional government and national government, is likely to help us move ahead more effectively. I mean, obviously there have been sort of bits of jostling have gone on between the previous national government and the, some of the Labour mayors, just to bring it down into one word. Do you think it's going to be easier now that we've got, more of that aligned, or do you think that's not so much an issue?
I would really, really hope so. So we know that cities are this pivotal piece of the puzzle to tackling climate change, but they cannot do it alone. So they need to work together with national government and also non-state actors, so including businesses, financial institutions, community organisations and the public is really crucial for cities to meet their net zero goals. And cities tell us that they need more from government to convert ambition into implementation and report a need for collaboration across all levels of government. So hopefully, as you say, with this change in government, this will be more successful for London, and we can try and overcome those barriers.
Thank you. James, I just wondered if you would agree with that. I mean, obviously the Committee on Climate Change has been beautifully cross-party and has had a strong role from Lord Deben, for example. It's also now just pulled in a new Chief Executive from Energy UK, Emma Pinchbeck, so seems to have those necessary linkages between the different political parties and the different actors that Roseanne was just referring to. I mean, obviously it would be best if everybody, regardless of party or political views, I'm speaking obviously in the context that there's a climate change denier who's just been elected as the President of the United States, so I'm feeling on slightly dangerous ground here. But it would obviously be best if everyone was sort of on the same page, regardless of political coloration. Do you think it makes any difference when people are more aligned, or...?
I mean, I think I would mostly just agree with the point that you just made, that what really matters and where the UK has been very strong over the years is having consensus on this across all the main political parties. And we really enjoyed that in the UK, really all the way back to Mrs. Thatcher talking about the insidious danger of climate change in 1989 at the UN, through to, where we are now, where, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, Liberals, Greens, all have really strong track records on this issue. There's still a lot more to do, but I think, compared with the division that we've seen in a lot of other countries, we do have a lot to be proud of in the consensus that we've managed in this country, and I strongly hope that that continues. Obviously, we have, changes of leadership and so on, but the facts haven't changed. If anything, it's just become more urgent. And so, that science, evidence-driven approach is in the end the only one that will succeed. And that really needs to be at the heart of decision-making. And I hope that is something that will continue.
Yes, well, thank goodness we don't have too many politicians here throwing around the fact that we need alternative facts or refusing to listen to scientists, but I'll pass back to the Chair. Thank you very much.
I wondered where that was going then. Assembly Member Tyrrell.
Thank you and good afternoon. So this is to James, first of all, and that is that the Climate Change Committee has published a number of studies reviewing the evidence on behaviour change, public engagement and net zero. Is a national public engagement strategy on climate action needed, and if so, what should it include in it?
So I think there is a very good case for it. I think we do have to understand that in of itself, more information is unlikely to have a large direct impact. So it's by no means a kind of silver bullet. But I think, we are in a world where there is increasing amounts of misinformation about climate, and where, our work, both looking at the evidence and also, convening things like citizens' panels, talking directly to the public, there is a strong desire that people can have objective facts designed for consumers. Our role is to advise government rather than to advise consumers. But, for the government to set out very clearly what is important, what's big and what's small, because I think people really find that hard, and the evidence suggests that people don't really have that knowledge, and to kind of bust some of the myths that are out there about some of the low-carbon solutions, so that people can then go about doing the things that they need to do without it being complicated and confusing for them. So, yes, I think it would be helpful, but let's not kind of think on its own it's going to be a magical solution.
Thank you for that. And then to both of you, do you have concerns that a reliance on regulatory measures without sufficient public support and compliance could lead to policies that are actually difficult to enforce, ultimately undermining process towards our net zero gains? And if we start with Roseanne.
Yeah, I think it's just important that there's a package of measures. So there's regulation, but there's also engagement and collaboration, and these achieving these kind of area-wide emissions reduction targets and building resilience in an inclusive and holistic way requires this multi-level collaboration involving diverse communities and stakeholders. So working with actors from the public and the private sector, including businesses, education and the NHS, can really unlock areas for joint action and lead to innovative solution, with each stakeholder bringing this unique insights and expertise. So it's not just one size fits all. We need to work in this holistic manner. And what we see for those UK authorities reporting to CDP is that these climate commissions and similar alliances bringing together kind of local actors around a common goal to achieve net zero emissions are increasingly being adopted.
I think it's a really important point you raise, and I agree with my colleague here. We have to take people with us on the road to net zero, and that means that we have to be asking people to do things that they feel are reasonable and that they can do within the resources, particularly in this cost of living crisis that we're in, driven of course by fossil fuels, but that doesn't make it easier for people to find money. And I think that is partly about engaging with people, understanding which aspects of this are easy and which are difficult, and which are perhaps difficult for some people, even if not for everybody. It's about ensuring that the incentives are there so that it is cost effective for people to make changes, that doing the right thing is also the thing that saves you money. Some of it is about regulation. We do need to phase out some of these old fossil fuel technologies, but we just need to make it easier for people to do things. And some of that is actually about removing regulations. So if you want to get a heat pump installed in a London terraced house, it's very difficult because you have to have planning permission if you want it within a metre of the boundary, which is, most of your garden in a London terraced house. But that rule is based on, the noise levels of heat pumps from years ago is no longer relevant. So actually, in some cases, just taking some of the regulations out would also help, just to make it, just make it easy for people. You don't really want every citizen to be having to apply for planning permission to get a heating system in their home.
Thank you. And back to Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. I skipped over a couple of things, so I'll come back to those in a minute. I just want to follow on from my colleague, Assembly Member Turrell, around the strategies that we can bring to bear to bring the public along on the journey to net zero. And just wondered, do you have any exemplars of anything that's been particularly, that's worked very well?
So I think you've got some things that the public are very heavily involved in and some things which actually you can get on with separately. So if I look at the two things where, we've probably made the most progress or are about to, and that look very different. In the power sector, the electricity that we all use has been very substantially decarbonised. Not completely, but very substantially. Most people have not really been affected by that. They've just got different electricity through the grid. There are quite a few parts of the net zero transition that look like that for most citizens. But if I look at something like electric vehicles, where we haven't made huge progress yet, but we're clearly at that tipping point where we are about to, that is a decision that each individual has to make to get an electric vehicle. So we have to have people understand that, that is something that is good for them, that it's a better car. And in that case, the fact that it's much cheaper to run and that the price of buying one has fallen a lot has made a big difference. But I think it's also, a lot of it is down to things, again, where local authorities can make a difference in terms of access to charge points. If people don't think they can charge these up, they're going to be very reluctant to buy. Where I live in London, there are charge points in the lamppost down the street. For people who don't have off-street parking, which is most Londoners, I suspect, certainly in inner London, those kind of things make a big difference because I can see, okay, I can park in my street, charge it up. That's going to work for me. So sometimes it's kind of what might seem small parts of the transition, the cost of that relative to the cost of the overall vehicle fleet. I mean, the vehicles are no more expensive now than the petrol vehicles almost, but it's a big cost for a household to buy a new car or a second-hand car. Is much, much smaller. It's a much smaller part, but actually that enables the much bigger part because you've made it easy for people to come with you on that journey. So I think it is often about thinking through that consumer journey. What is it that people need to do? Where are the things that they may find difficult? How can I make that easier for people? But also getting the money right.
Are there any particularly good examples of where that's gone more quickly, though, either in this country or indeed abroad, actually, where there's a sort of higher take-up of, you mentioned electric vehicles. I would maybe point to Wales, where they've been doing a lot more around segregation of rubbish from recycling and food waste and things like that. Are there examples that we can look to in London that would help us sort of move forward more quickly on some of these things?
So there certainly are places that are going faster than us in parts of this. As you say, Wales is doing particularly well on its recycling rate. Germany is also a leader in that. In terms of vehicles, actually the UK is doing pretty well now in the electric vehicle transition. But in terms of heat and buildings, we're doing really badly. Most of the other comparable countries in Europe are doing a lot better than us.
So who would you say is doing better? Obviously, I think Germany, I know that they've moved to sort of installing 140, I think we install about 140,000 heat pumps every other year or something, and they're installing 140,000 heat pumps a month.
So, almost all the European countries now are doing better than us on heat pumps. The ones that are doing best are the Scandinavian countries, where, now a majority of homes have heat pumps. Of course, it's very cold in the winter in Scandinavia, so it's a good example of how effective heat pumps can be. But we could also look to countries like the Netherlands. The Netherlands has a very similar heating system to us. It uses a lot of gas because they also have North Sea gas. But we have seen very big increases in the rate of take-up of heat pumps in recent years because they've made it cost-effective for households. And again, some of those kind of planning barriers that we have, I think, they don't face in most European countries. So if you make it easy for people and you get the incentives, and that's both kind of upfront support, which we do have now in this country, the boiler upgrade scheme, but also the relative cost of gas and electricity. We make electricity very expensive in this country by putting extra costs onto it that aren't the economic cost of generating electricity. And that creates a ratio of gas to electric prices, which makes it very hard for a heat pump to be cost effective. Other countries have gone a lot further in terms of getting those price ratios right. And in some cases, like say Poland, that's because the alternative was oil or coal that was very expensive anyway. So you've seen big increases there. But in places like France or Germany or the Netherlands, you are often pushing gas off the system.
So how have they managed to persuade people to take this up? Has there been sort of public engagement as well as, driving behaviour change through incentives, which seem to be what you were referring to in terms of, grants up front, or the cost of energy once you're clicked onto the heat pump is lower. Has there been much public engagement about why people should switch from gas to a heat pump, or has it all been about the incentives?
So I'm not an expert on precisely what's happened in any of those countries, but I think there certainly has been more debate on it and more explanation to the public. It is beginning to change, and I should give credit both to the current government and actually to the previous government towards the end of its term for starting to advertise things like the boiler upgrade scheme and starting to set out the importance of this. But really until about a year, maybe slightly longer ago, the government was very quiet on this, didn't talk about it, even though it offered support, didn't advertise that to people. And I think that is part of the reason why there's a lot of confusion amongst people. Certainly when we do exercises, we find that people are much clearer on what electric cars are all about than they are about heat pumps. So I think people do start further back because there has been less of a conversation with them about both the why we need to do this and the how of doing it.
And we also changed our target, because at one point we were saying all new installs can no longer be gas boilers, they've got to be heat pumps from 2030. Obviously, a city like London has developed more ambitious targets for achieving net zero, talking about 2030 rather than 2050. Now, that may not be achievable. In fact, I would probably argue that it isn't. But is it helpful to have a sort of more ambitious target? And is it also helpful, once you've set a target, for flipping over from being able to purchase new boilers or new vehicles that use fossil to insisting that everybody use fossil free? Is it good to stick with targets that you've set?
So I think the most important thing is policy action.
Yeah.
That is more important than targets. I think you're right that if you're going to say to people, well, we're going to stop the sale of a high carbon technology from a particular date, it is important then to stick to that and not to keep flip-flopping. Because both households start to internalise that, and if they start seeing flip-flopping, they are bound to think, well, this may never happen. And it goes down the kind of to-do list because people are busy, they've got lots of concerns. But also for businesses that need to invest, and that's both large businesses making heat pumps, say, but also, sole traders. Do I invest in learning how to install heat pumps? Yeah. That's a big deal for somebody who spends their day installing boilers and is a kind of sole trader. They've got to take days off work and training. So if people start to think, is that going to work? Is it not going to work? They'll put it off. It's a rational response. Whereas if government is clear about this and says, look, this is the date, and we're sticking to it, then people kind of wake up and they think, okay, well, I better take action. And I may not take it today, but I know I've got this window to act in. And in fact, I can think about, well, maybe I'm going to move house. Maybe I'll do it after I've moved house. Or, maybe I'll wait till, my kids have finished their GCSEs and do it after that in the summer when, it's a bit easier to switch a heating system. So you want to give people the ability to kind of plan these things out. And you want to give business the ability to invest with confidence, knowing that there will be a market for what they're investing in.
Yeah, retooling production lines is not something you can do in 5 minutes, either to produce more electric vehicles or more heat pumps. The government has set up this new energy mission board in July. Do you think that the mission-led approach is going to have an impact on progress towards net zero, or is this just a change of terminology at government level that is just going to, it's just words being changed rather than something else? I
think it's a little early to answer that question.
Right.
If I'm honest, we don't really know what difference it's making. I should say that we're very pleased that our former chief executive, Chris Stark, has been appointed to head the mission board, because if anyone can make this happen, it's Chris. So that's definitely going to make a difference. I think exactly how mission-led government works, I think we have to give it time to see.
Yes, I think you're the acting chief executive in between Chris Stark and, as I mentioned earlier, Emma Pinchback. So quite some dynamic individuals here who I think can help push these things forward. I mean, I tend to agree with you. Probably at this stage, you can't really tell because it's only been set up for a few months. What about in terms of the budget? There's an additional 3.4 billion allocated towards the Warmer Homes programme, and I think both you and Roseanne mentioned the getting local authorities more involved because they're going to know who the people are who are coldest. Do you think that's going to benefit Londoners and generally the transition to net zero?
Sorry. So I would say, as you mentioned, I think with cities, with their proximity to local communities and vulnerable people, are really well placed to engage closely with those groups and to know their needs. Lots of local authorities report to us that they're engaging with communities using methods such as citizens' assemblies, youth climate partnerships and partnerships with community groups. And this really enables local authorities to deepen their understanding of climate change impacts in communities and get their input on climate action decisions. So by putting these vulnerable groups at the heart of these decisions, more co-benefits will be unlocked and better decisions will be made for the future growth and equity of cities.
And the extra money in the budget? I mean, 3.4 billion, that has to help in
Always
terms
welcome.
of engaging people and then also making their homes warmer.
Exactly, yeah.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And James, you put it as the cost of living crisis fueled by the fossil fuel crisis. What role do workers have in this, and particularly the trade unions? I know you said the role of the Committee on Climate Change is to advise governments, not workers or trade unions, but what role should governments be playing with trade unions?
So I think it very much depends on the sector of the economy that you're talking about. There are lots of sectors of the economy where actually actions by workers and employers are relatively straightforward. If I own a vehicle fleet, I need to turn that over to electric vehicles. If I own a building, I need to think about how that is heated. But, that isn't by and large going to change the day-to-day activities of the workforce. Even if you're, say, a lorry driver, yes, you'll have to recharge instead of refueling, so there are some changes, but it's not going to fundamentally change the job that you do. There are some people for whom that's not true. And some of that is on the opportunity side and some of that is on the risk side. So, for example, we've talked a lot about heat pump installers. That's a job that we are going to need up and down the country. It's a relatively skilled job for people without a university degree, should pay a decent wage, have good conditions. It can't be outsourced to China. It's not going to get taken over by AI. These are real opportunities for firms and workers and unions to engage in training, upskill people, bring in new people, perhaps think about the nature of that workforce. At the moment you have a very older male workforce. There are opportunities for a more diverse workforce as you turn that over as people retire and you're bringing in people. And of course, that's a job where people can feel that they're really contributing to tackling the climate crisis. And we know for a lot of young people that's really appealing. But you also have some industries, and I suspect this is not a particular issue within London, but in some communities, where the industry is going to shrink. So oil and gas, most obviously. And so we need to get ahead of that as a country and think about, well, what is the economic solution for a place like Aberdeen or Shetland once the oil industry has gone? Because if you leave it until that happens and then try and kind of mop up afterwards, we know that places can fall a long way because their main employment sources have disappeared, and it's very hard to kind of then pick a place back up and recover. It's not impossible, but we've seen places that have done very badly through those kind of unmanaged transitions. And we know this is coming. This isn't some kind of shock from the blue that's going to wipe out an industry. We know, even regardless, actually, in the oil industry case of net zero, the basin is becoming exhausted. So people are going to have to transition. So what are the new employment opportunities? Some of those could be in net zero aligned industries. So it could be something like offshore wind in a place like Aberdeen. But they don't have to be. Shetland has a spaceport. Perhaps that's a future high-skilled industry for a place like that. But you need to know, what are the things that are going to fit with the kind of workforce you've got. There's no good saying to people in Port Talbot, well, we think you should become a kind of consultancy centre. It's a manufacturing city. You need to think about what the right jobs are that are going to fit with the skills that you've got there. And, we've left it late with Port Talbot. We should have been thinking about that for years because we knew this transition was going to happen. I mean, the plant's been losing money for years, if nothing else. But we haven't acted. So let's act, workers, firms, unions, government, to find solutions for those places. Thankfully, it is not many places. But if you live in one of those places, it's really important.
Yeah, I think this is articulated really well. So can I just ask a final question? I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Roberts. Which is, so I was at Port Talbot last year and spoke to some of the workers, and it was very obvious to anyone that this was about to happen, but it did seem to come to a shock to the government in terms of there didn't seem to be a plan in place. Now, in my role here, we're constantly thinking about what powers does the mayor have, what can he do, and one of those questions often comes to procurement. And like when I think, for instance, should there have been I think there should, spoiler, a nationalised strategy around steel, for instance, to nationalise steel and then create a whole kind of green industry there. Not getting too lost in the steel conversation, but what role do mayors and cities, and particularly in London, have, particularly around procurement, to drive this just transition? Yeah, that's a big question, I suppose.
It is a big question. I think there is a role for public procurement. I think you would want to see that probably at a national scale to get the volume of demand. But, in some of these commodities, steel is a good example, where you've got a low-carbon alternative, but that low-carbon alternative probably will be more expensive, at least for a while, than the high-carbon alternative. The risk is you just import the high-carbon alternative instead of making the low-carbon alternative domestically. So setting product standards, saying if you want to buy this product in the UK, it has to achieve this level of carbon emissions. And by the way, the government is going to lead. Government is going to buy those low-carbon products first, so that then people have an incentive to invest knowing that they've got certain demand. So, yeah, the British government does buy a certain amount of steel for the rail network, for example. I guess the London government as well for your rail network. Concrete, the highways are a big purchaser of these things. So there are things where the government can make a significant difference by pulling through demand for the low-carbon version. That's not a kind of, protectionist, we must buy it in Britain, because that probably clashes with all our trade relations. So, if it's bought from another country, but it has to meet the same standards. But it creates a level playing field for the low-carbon option, rather than it always trying to fight against the costs versus a high-carbon alternative.
I'm resisting getting to a trade relations conversation, because I think that's fascinating. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. A question for Roseanne, please. It's just a fairly straightforward one, which is, how does London compare with other cities in terms of its ambitions and plans for reducing emissions and achieving net zero by 2030?
Sure. So once cities submit their questionnaire to CDP, we provide a score to cities, and I'm pleased to report that London has been on the A list for the past 5 years. The average score for CDP cities in Europe is C, so London is really, really leading the way in terms of its climate plans and its actions. And this scoring process is really, really an opportunity for cities to get feedback on their plans, and they can use this score to benchmark their progress against others and identify areas to improve on. So London is really leading the way with its climate ambitions and plans in comparison to many of our cities.
Thank you. And just in terms of public engagement, do you think it's helpful that quite often we tend to talk about targets? And asking the public to understand a target rather than objectives. Is it a helpful measure, a target?
Yes, I think ambitious targets are really essential to drive the action that we need, and London does have ambitious targets. This, failure to kind of set these targets and to act at city level does pose significant risks, in terms of health and well-being of citizens, but as well as kind of economic risks. So loss of investor confidence in the city if the city is not meeting the goals they are setting. So we do encourage cities to not only set net zero targets. Our guiding principle is what gets measured gets managed. So by setting targets and by reporting against them, the city can really have an idea of how they are progressing towards those targets. So for us, targets are very essential.
Okay. And what would you suggest are the risks inherent if those targets are not met in terms of just general confidence?
Sure. So there's reputational risk, obviously, but I think we would just reiterate that targets are really, really important, and to meet those kind of global goals that we need to make, these targets are essential.
Okay, thank you. My second question, this is to James. So let me see. So London's identified buildings, energy and transport as the largest areas to tackle to bring down emissions for the capital. For example, it estimates 2.2 million heat pumps will be needed by 2030 to achieve net zero. Is it realistic to think that these levels are possible?
So I think the focus is in the right area. Definitely transport and buildings are going to be the biggest areas. They're the biggest areas in the country as a whole. They're certainly going to be the biggest areas in London. I think those targets and the kind of plan set out in the Element Energy report, they're extraordinarily ambitious, and they are premised in that analysis on actions by central government, without which they would seem extremely unlikely to occur. But I think what is important is to focus on the actions that are needed. Every heat pump that we install is reducing our reliance on gas. So that's good for emissions, it's good for the cost of living, and it's good for our kind of energy security. So, even if we don't achieve those numbers, having the priority in those areas is really what matters, getting as far as we can.
Excellent, thank you. And just one or two others. So what role do you think new technologies will play in helping people use energy differently and matching clean energy with demand?
So I think there's a lot of scope here. I would start from the view that most of the technologies that we need to get to net zero already exist. Heat pumps, electric cars, electrifying industry. So we don't need what I think of as kind of magical technologies, things that might turn up in 20 years' time, but really they might not. But more straightforward things. So yes, using AI to control my heating system so that I only put as much energy into it as I actually need to get my home to the temperature I want. That kind of technology exists today. As you say, helping balance the electrical system is one of the things that the system operator talked about. Because, we have a big peak of energy demand in the evening, and then much less at kind of 2 a.m. in the morning. If I've got an electric car and I can operate that two-way, that does require a slightly different charger, but it's not a difficult thing to do. Then my car can power my house at 7 p.m. and at 2 a.m. my house can power my car. And I don't, as a citizen, I don't have to do any. Once I've got the kit installed, it does it all for me. And of course, it knows what the weather forecast is going to be for the next day, and it knows how much I need the car charged by at 7 a.m. in the morning or whenever to go to work. So all of that can be done without the citizen having to kind of get up in the middle of the night and plug the car in. And that helps balance the electrical system, which makes it cheaper. I need fewer plants available at 7 p.m. To deal with that peak. So it's good for the cost of electricity for everyone. That person probably gets a discount. There are tariffs available and so on that help them. And we need to build less stuff so we can get to net zero faster.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. If I can just ask a couple of questions around comms, around how we communicate the climate risks. Arguably the world is in a darker place now after America's election last night, but even, a week before that, we saw what's happening in Valencia and all around the world, the effects of climate risks. Now, we often talk about that 1.5 degree target. And sometimes, and the mayor, to be fair, I've never heard him do this, but talks about 2 degrees as if, we just slightly miss it. But there's a very significant difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. But even 1.5 degrees, and this is the really hard bit to communicate as a politician, means a significant change in how people live, and a lot of those climate risks are already baked in through feedback loops, and that's where the adaptation conversation comes in. Again, what role is there for mayors, and particularly because we're in London for this city mayor, to communicate that in a way that doesn't create paralysis through fear, but is also realistic and truthful with people?
It is a challenging narrative. You're trying to explain to people both that they have agency, that we can make things better, but also that things are still nonetheless going to get worse in any world. And it's hard to get that over. But I think I would emphasize two things. I think the first is that every 0.1 degree is worth fighting for. It's not all about, if we fail on 1.5, it's suddenly 2. As you say, there's a big difference between those two things, and each 0.1 is worth fighting for. So we should be doing everything we can, and that's kind of regardless of, the US election or whatever. There are opportunities here, and, if the US doesn't wish to pursue these economic opportunities, we should seize them, right? But I think it is also important to get over to people what is being done and what needs to be done on adaptation. I would understand that people would be pretty afraid about what's happened in Valencia. They would want to know, does that risk apply here? And anyway, to the extent that flooding is clearly a risk here, well, what is happening to ensure that people are safe, that the risks are managed as well as that they can be, that, something like the underground system isn't suddenly going to flood and people be trapped down there. So I think there are important messages on the adaptation side but it's also actions, of course. What is the answer to increased risk of surface water flooding in a place like London where there's lots of hard surface, so the risks are quite concentrated, and where we saw, of course, flooding a few years ago. If you're taking action, if you can say, look, we are protecting you, then it's easier. You can't take those risks away entirely, but at least you've got a conversation you can have with people that says, look, we can do these things. And some of that conversation may also be, look, we'd quite like you to do things. Could you stop paving over all your garden?
Right.
Sorry, Zach,
please.
I would just add to that as to echo James's thoughts, this is where data is really important as well. So by cities reporting their data and reporting the actions on climate change, that and making that data accessible. So at CDP, all our cities' data is available to the public, so that they can look at that, so that international groups can look at that, and organisations can see this data and see the action that is taking place is really important as well.
That's really helpful. So we're talking about objective fact. Asama Mahfouz.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks for your answers on that. I think I've just come back from Madrid actually last week, and certainly for Spaniards, they're going to see the very real consequences of climate change in one of their major cities. Obviously, other cities have also been impacted, and many thousands have lost their homes and still lost. So our thoughts, obviously, with them at this time. But when you talk about 0.1 degrees and we talk about 1.5 and 2, now everyone around these tables will completely understand the impact of that. And you talked about data, Roseanne, but the reality is you talked about at the start, bringing people with us. These are concepts, these are non-tangible things to people on a day-to-day basis, and simply educating people as to these will be beneficial for the planet, when the pushback, unfortunately, is often, well, why should I do it if they see other countries not doing it or other people not doing it, is that they're having to make a sacrifice, is the way they see it. Now, you talked about the incentives, and so how do we make sure that those incentives are real, tangible, and achievable for many more people in the opportunity between now and 2030 from a London perspective?
Yes, I do think it is much easier to ask people to do the right thing if it is also financially sensible, right? And that sends a signal to people that we really mean it. And it's not like I'm not thinking, oh, everyone's kind of greedy and in it for themselves. People will realistically say, well, if we're not setting things up that way, like, why are you trying to push me to do this thing? Kind of get on side, and I'll be on side too. And I think our experience is that most people are on side with this. They may not understand all the abstract climate science, but they can look out the window and they see this is happening. So I think it is about making that worthwhile for people. The real challenge here for citizens is around building heat, because electric vehicles now, they're increasingly becoming cost effective, right? We would expect to see sticker price parity within the next few years. We've already got that in the second-hand market, which of course is where most people buy their cars. And there are huge savings on running costs. So I think that already makes a lot of sense for people, and we're seeing that in the take-up. Buildings are more difficult because there's this big one-off cost of converting a building which is designed around, well, it's probably designed around coal, actually, if you're in a kind of London property, but has been redesigned around gas, and we need to redesign it again around a heat pump. I think, you know, financially, there are two big things there. One is the upfront payment, and actually we do have the boiler upgrade scheme, making people understand that that's available to them. And the other is this relative price of electricity and gas, which I'm afraid does require action by national government. But I think where local government can really come in on this is both around the energy efficiency side of things. So you can reduce the whole bill by just making the home less leaky. But also some of these things which are, they may not be a financial cost, though they can be, but also kind of hassle costs. So the planning system, of course, you can't change all the national planning rules, but ensuring that there's a fast-track, simple way of getting planning permission. And when you are talking to central government saying, look, we've got X million terraced homes in London for which this rule doesn't apply, can we please kind of change that? I think, you know, you can bring down the financial cost and also the kind of time burden of installing these things quite straightforwardly. I think also London government, both the GLA and the boroughs, and also central government within London, own a lot of property. So getting that converted will help build the skills in the workforce, and some of that will be relevant to decarbonising homes, and some of it will be relevant to decarbonising offices. There's a lot of office space of one sort or another in London. The building that I'm in Canary Wharf, which is now owned by the government, we're looking at getting heat pumps into that building. So that's building a labour force, a skill set that can be used by all the other towers in Canary Wharf. So these things are things that, you know, London government can lead on or assemble coalitions of people. You know, get on the phone to the electricity distribution operator. You know, they've got to listen to you guys. I mean, to the extent they listen to anyone.
Yes, just to add to James's point, I think this is where that collaboration with businesses is really, really key. You know, this is an opportunity for business growth. This is an opportunity for green jobs, and by cities can be more nimble sometimes, the national government, and can work more closely with businesses in their cities, and that kind of working together can really present some opportunities.
Sorry, just on that point, because I think there's a real opportunity there in terms of rebuilding the economy and building back a greener economy, more sustainable. So when we talk about creating those green jobs and green innovation, so what areas could we perhaps lead on as London and surrounding areas in developing technology, or, you know, in those installations, which could be perhaps something that we're not just leading on nationwide, but actually sort of potentially on a wider scale across Europe? If there is anything that you feel that we can do.
Yeah, well, I mean, very obviously finance. I mean, this is a hugely capital-intensive process. A lot of what we are doing is replacing the use of fossil fuels, which are very operational cost, mostly imported these days, with a capital item which has from very low running costs. I mean, a wind turbine or a solar panel, obviously the basic energy is free, right? Even if I need to maintain it or whatever. So there's a huge finance need for those capital assets. And of course, London is the finance centre of the world. So there's real opportunities there in, you know, probably the strongest business within the London area for financing this around the world. Insurance, again, you have similar kind of issues, as well as on the adaptation side, where insurance companies will need to be nimble to work out how to deal with risks for which they don't have a long track record of data. You know, people who can crack those problems will get into markets around the world. So I think, you know, London has a lot of strengths as an economy, and is probably going to do best by playing to those strengths.
Yes, the green finance angle, and I know London is already doing a lot of work on that, and just skills as well. You know, London is the skills capital. It's got that kind of vitality and that skills piece already, and looking at how to kind of work alongside the kind of green jobs opportunities will be really important.
Thank you.
Thanks. Can I just finish off with, I guess it's I'll finish off from me unless there's any other questions. This idea of financial interest, because I would argue that some of that has got us into a mess we're in already. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be utilising where we can, and we've been talking about economic opportunity. I absolutely agree. You know, retrofitting someone's home, for instance, you're reducing people's bills, you're reducing emissions, and you're creating jobs. That's all great, but it does feel like, for instance, we've spoken about electric vehicles a fair few times, but we actually also need traffic reduction, and it feels like those kind of conversations where the things can sometimes be in tension. I guess aviation is another example. The Committee on Climate Change says that, you know, expansion of airports is non-compatible with net zero, but then we often have city mayors talking about needing more aviation for international growth, and we have a Prime Minister who says that economic growth is a very kind of central mission to everything. We've not talked about nature in this session, obviously, because it's about climate, but these things can all be in conflict. Is the answer here around citizens' assemblies to negotiate these kind of ideas? Is it just about leadership from politicians to lead the way, or is there another space here where some of these things can be managed?
I mean, I think, you know, you can use a mix. I think obviously we come at it from a predominantly evidence-based view. So we would ask the question of, well, what can we achieve on the demand side? What does the evidence show us? What do leading cities around the world achieve in terms of their modal share? London does pretty well, right? But you're not going to get that same modal share in a smaller town where the economies of scale and density that apply in a city like London, which make public transport very successful, those aren't going to apply in smaller cities elsewhere. So what can you get in a smaller city? It's going to be a different mix. So we would come at it from that approach, because if you can do it on the demand side, it's nearly always going to be cheaper, right? But the evidence suggests that you can only get so far with those things, and that's why you want the technology as well. In terms of kind of citizens' assembly, obviously there was one a few years ago, very interesting process. I wasn't personally involved, but the CCC had a lot of people there. But we do continue to do engagements. We've done a citizens panel as part of our 7th carbon budget work, which will come out early next year, and it's very interesting. Particularly, we were focused on these kind of issues. What is it that people think is a reasonable change to make? What would help them make those changes? But then ultimately, some of these things are about political leadership. People often want political leadership, and you know, these are political choices about, you know, what do we expect from people, and what are we? In some cases, you know, are we going to allow the airport to expand? A politician has to make that choice. You know, citizens' assemblies can inform that. So I think it is, you know, it is the combination of all of these things. We try and play our part as the provider of evidence and analysis, but we're also engaged with these other parts of the system.
Thank you. Roseanne, did you want to come in at all?
No, just to add, yeah, it's a combination of these things, and I think working across kind of various kind of political leadership, but also projects on the ground is so essential for cities at the moment, and that's what kind of we're really seeing cities sort of stepping up and doing this.
Thank you very much. And stepping up and doing this feels like a good place to end. And thank you both so much for your contributions. It was a really fascinating discussion. To the rest of the committee, we're going to adjourn for 5 minutes, and then we'll be back with our second panel. But once again, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you. Welcome back to our second part of the session today. I'd like to welcome our guests. We have Meti Koban, MBE, Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, Catherine Barber, Assistant Director of Environment and Energy at the Greater London Authority, and Pete Dorr, Head of Climate Change at the Greater London Authority. Welcome back to the committee to all three of you, who I know have been a fair few times now. I know you were just in the gallery for the first part of the discussion. So, Meti, if I can come to you, we heard from our last investigation from Dr. Ashok Sinha from Ashton that decarbonisation has occurred in the past decade, significant decarbonisation, but many of the hardest challenges are still to come, which I think was echoed in the conversation we just had. How does the GLA monitor London-wide progress?
Yeah, firstly, thanks, Chair, for having me back to the Environment Committee. So, great question. So, there's a number of ways in which the GLA monitors progress in relation to our progress to net zero by 2030. I mean, we've obviously got the Legge report, which was came out sort of just recently. We also had the energy monitoring report as well, which showed significant improvements. Actually, I've got some of the data here, which shows that in London, we're leading the way with CO2 emissions projected to be less than half the levels required by national building regulations, and that's a staggering reduction of 32,000 tonnes. We've also seen more than a quarter of these carbon savings coming from energy efficiency alone, which is basically equivalent of like loft installation in more than 13,000 homes. So that's, you know, we've got the energy monitoring report. We've also got the GLA group in terms of how we report in comparison to sort of the wider sort of you know, either nationally or what else happens there. But then also, as you've also heard from CDP, from Roseanne, you would have seen that, you know, London is obviously grade A listed in relation to the progress that we have made, and it's in the top 10% of global cities. So there's a number of ways, obviously, in which we sort of report on progress that we're making in relation to our pathways and our progress to net zero.
Thanks. And what would you say the key milestones or indicators between now and 2030, where you kind of keep regularly checking in and going, yes, we're entirely on target, or this bit needs some real work?
Yeah, so look, I think all of those different avenues that I mentioned, they're all sort of key milestones, and those are all things that we should be accountable and transparent in terms of how we report on that data, and how we're obviously accountable to the public, to the committee, to obviously decision makers across London. And, you know, what we're very much focused on right now in London is obviously making sure that we know we've got an important job to do. I mean, you spoke about very eloquently about the impact of the flash floods in Valencia. You know, time is not on our side. We've got to crack on and deliver, and that's one of the key things that the Mayor was very clear with me when I took my job, which is making sure that we're helping making London more resilient to the impacts of climate change. But also that point that, again, that you made, which is around how do we make sure that we get the benefits of the transition, around the green transition, be it around the conversation about the linking, the sort of the climate and the nature point, around how we improve access to green space and to nature flourish across our city, and also how we bring about the retrofit revolution that we desperately need. The good thing is that for the first time you have a government who's not working against the Mayor of London, and together with a strength of partnerships with the boroughs, what we will hopefully be able to see over the next 5 years is really real progress in being able to deliver on action. So we'll continue to monitor through all of the sort of the legal statutory ways in which we monitor, but of course, you know, we'll make sure that we keep Londoners updated about the progress that we're making.
I don't want to sidetrack too much, but there was a water march on Sunday, and I saw that you were marching at the front with Jenny Jones, in fact, who is the ex-Deputy Mayor for London. It's curious, though, that you're marching to ask for government to do something, and you've just talked about for the first time the government and the GLA are aligned. Why march? What lobbying power do you have?
Well, I think firstly, the issue of water quality is an issue of social justice. It's an issue that Steve Reed, Secretary of State, has recognised and has heard loud and clear the call from campaigners to make sure that we're able to support and holding our water utility companies to account. The protest was merely about, you know, how we make sure that we do sort of address the social justice point on water quality. And, you know, I'm there, you know, we heard loud and clear the calls from all of the thousands of campaigners that came all across from London, but also from other parts of the country, to really ask us to do much more on what we can do. And that's why I'm proud that, you know, we announced our pledge to clean our rivers and waterways in the next decade. The Mayor is committed to making sure that we can convene a roundtable in the new year, bringing together all the different key actors that we're going to need to be able to help achieve, you know, all of the things that the people on the march were calling for, and that's what we're very much focused on.
I think, I don't know if you misunderstood my question, because I entirely agree and I totally support the march, but if you're marching, that suggests that the government aren't doing something, or there's a gap where you're going, I'm here on this march because I'm protesting. So is the government giving London what it needs?
Well, I think the government is giving London what it needs with its recent announcements on how it plans to hold water utility companies to account and to regulate through the regulator authority. I think, actually, Chair, if you sort of were at the march, I think one of the things that I heard very loud and clear from the people on the march was actually about raising awareness around the issue of water quality to the public too, and that was another key aspect of it. And I think one of the heartwarming things have been over the past, like 6 to 12 months is the conversation around water, both in terms of water quality, both in terms of water quantity, but also in terms of like how we make sure that we protect against flood resilience as well. So I think, there were a number of different aims of that march. One of the things, I didn't hear anyone on the march actually being hostile to the government. Actually, I think everyone was very encouraged by the announcements by the Secretary of State. What they want and what we all want is ultimately to see action. It's a multi-layered approach on how we can achieve where we need to get to in terms of cleaning our waterways. And hopefully what we'll see is with government who's ambitious, a mayor who's ambitious, and the local authorities and all the other active partners that we need, we're able to sort of bring about what we all want to see from the march.
Well, I'm pretty cross with the government, but you're not here to hear my opinions. I'm going to come to Assemblymember Cooper and then Assemblymember Prince. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you. I don't think anyone would disagree with you, Deputy Mayor, on the need for London to be more resilient and for us to have improved biodiversity, water quality, and to press ahead with retrofit. I think those were the areas that you mentioned. But the Chair was asking about sort of key milestones and indicators, and obviously that on the way between now and 2030. And we've got a number of things that we signed off in this committee in the now agreed mayoral environment strategy, so that's been around since May 2018, and quite a number of those are targets relating to 2030. And I just wondered if you were planning over the forthcoming period, because we are getting closer and closer to 2030 now. Obviously, it was introduced in 2018, so it had 12 years at that point to run. So, for example, things like reduction and recycling plans, which obviously have been agreed with the boroughs to reduce waste, and there's targets for waste reduction and improving recycling. And I just wondered if that is still going to be something that we're going to be aiming for, those targets, and will we have interim targets? And there's a couple of other areas. I mean, obviously, one of the interesting things is because the Mayor has done so much work on addressing emissions from vehicles, we now, which in 2016, when I was elected, were more than 50% of fossil emissions in London came from vehicles. Now it's buildings. What more are we going to be doing? It's not just about good building standards in the new build sector, but it is also, as you point out, retrofit. Is there anything that we're going to be monitoring in terms of targets between now and 2030 for retrofit? Because we know that there's so many operational emissions from fossil coming out of our buildings, and obviously we're talking about heat pumps literally only half an hour ago. I just wondered if there's going to be some other targets there, and another one, talking of water, which of course is also in the environment plan. And I just wondered if we are going to be hearing regularly about the progress towards a new Thames barrier, because whilst I agree that obviously we need to be more resilient and we need mitigation and adaptation, I think it's pretty completely acknowledged that we will need a second Thames barrier. And I just wondered if we're going to have some milestones about making sure that we get that fitted in time, because that's a huge infrastructure project. And I think we all know that this country's been pretty bad at sticking to doing anything on time in terms of a big project. So I don't know whether it's something you want to answer, or maybe Catherine or Pete want to come in on, because some of these are things that obviously have been going on for some time now, as I mentioned. Thank you.
Those are really good questions. And I'll start with the reverse order, and maybe Catherine and Pete might want to come in on this. But I actually had the opportunity to visit the Thames Barrier, and I met with the Chief Executive, but also the London Director of the Environment Agency, and obviously they have a reporting mechanism in update to sort of the new barrier that will need to be built. I know the timeline for that is 2070 from when it needs to be built, and there is conversation that's currently happening with I guess, with government around sort of the proposal of the new barrier. But Pete and Catherine may want to sort of come in more. Maybe I'll take the other sort of questions before I sort of hand over. I think the other key thing to say is so on the sort of the targets and the key milestones, I should have just said, actually, you know, a key milestone and targets for us is obviously our manifesto pledges that we put forward to London, and where the mayor was obviously elected to sort of to deliver for London. And, you know, that includes obviously, you know, for example, the 40,000 electric vehicle chargers that we announced. It includes, for example, achieving zero emission bus fleet in London. It includes, for example, the bike parking spaces, secure bike parking spaces for Londoners that we've announced. There's a whole package of manifesto pledges where, you know, there are sort of numbers attached to it in terms of what we hope to achieve. That's what Londoners elected the mayor in his historic third term. And, you know, those are all key milestones that we will also be sort of updating and making sure that that's what we're focused on, which is around how do we sort of make sure that we deliver on the manifesto that the mayor is elected on. And then in relation to...
I understand that, and you have made that point to us before. I guess I'm just asking then, how relevant is the London environment strategy then? Because obviously some of the things that were incorporated into that environment strategy, which came out of the manifesto from 2016, and that is still the London environment strategy that's in operation now, presumably we're not only focusing on the more recent manifesto pledges, we're still aiming to implement the things from the original strategy as well. And I think we have said, you know, or are you planning to update it?
Yeah, there's a number of things that are happening across the GLA that we're focused on, be it obviously on our statutory through the London Environment Strategy, be it through the sort of the climate budgeting work, be it through the pathways to sort of net zero. These are all things that are happening simultaneously, and of course the manifesto delivery. The point I make about the manifesto delivery point is obviously because that's what, you know, the mandate is there for the mayor to sort of to deliver. But all those pieces of work are sort of working on coinciding with each other. The other final thing I'll just say before I bring in Pete and Catherine on the sort of the barrier is on the retrofit sort of conversation. I actually think it's really positive to see the government, you know, taking that forward in part of the new budget. It's a very ambitious budget around its retrofit agenda, and obviously what we want to see is that money being unlocked for London, and that's one of the things that we're lobbying for, and making sure that we're pushing forward and helping support councils around that agenda, because it is something that obviously ultimately will be delivered through local authorities. But I don't know if Catherine and Pete want to come in.
Yeah, sure. I think we're all hoping that London gets its fair share.
Yeah.
Perhaps I could come in on the question of milestones and targets, and then turn to Pete on the barrier. So I suppose it's worth saying that on the LES we've published 4 progress reports since it was published, the most recent one being earlier this year. So we're quite up to date in putting data in the public domain about progress against those targets. And we continue to monitor them, producing data to try to understand the impact it's having. And as the Deputy Mayor said, LEGI comes out every year, and so we can see what's happening in terms of the trajectory for building emissions, for transport emissions, waste emissions, etc. And that gives us a sense of whether we're on the right pathway or not. Of course, we don't have all of the data for things like retrofit, because we know what we control as the GLA. We've got our own spending programmes, and in the last mayoral term we reported quarterly to the Assembly on how many homes we'd retrofitted or installed solar panels on with mayoral support. And through climate budgeting, we also report annually on the net zero 2030 targets for the whole of the GLA group, and what is being funded and then what is delivered as well. But in terms of the other owners of property, whether that is boroughs, housing associations or private owners, that data is more fragmented. One of our priorities this year is working with London councils and the boroughs and the housing associations to try to have a better picture of all of those numbers put together. So I'd be happy to update you on that later.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll come in on the Thames Estuary one. Thank you. It's a very good question. Assemblymember Cooper will remember the adaptive plan was published last year, and both at a political level and an officer level, we've been very engaged in that with the Environment Agency and other stakeholders in shaping that. Some of the key things we wrote to the government at the time about on the publication of that plan, I think 2 very, very critical things. One was to put the plan on a statutory footing. So Baroness Brown, you'll recall, wrote particularly about that. And second is about the challenge of figuring out how we finance the barrier. Yes, it sounds a long time away, but in truth, we need to be making those calls within the next decade. So there's a piece of work now underway, led by the EA, and again, officers across the organisation and other organisations are engaged in this, which is looking at, a financing strategy basically for the Thames estuary barrier. So that is due. The EA are due to publish that in 2025. So that gives, a long enough runway, sorry for using the term runway, but runway into sort of identifying, how we finance some of those challenges. And just to sort of flag a couple of the other things which were published in that report for the GLA to do, one around riverside strategies. So through the London Plan, we'll be looking to work with London boroughs, basically, to push the riverside strategies forward over this next London Plan period. And we're also looking at our own assets and what we will need to look at upgrading over the course of the Thames Estuary Plan as well. So that's a couple of things we're actively doing at the moment whilst working with the EA on the finance plan.
Yeah, because it sounds like it's a long way away, 2070, but it actually isn't. And also because we can see that climate change seems to be accelerating and may, of course, as a consequence of events on the other side of the pond, accelerate still further. So that's really good to hear. We've also taken the opportunity to meet with the regional director of the EA from London, but also of the two neighbouring areas, and as well as the financing and the adaptive pathways. One of the issues that was raised with us, obviously the issue about the banks along the river, which you've just referred to, but is the issue of the safeguarding of the sites on either side of the river. So can I assume that if you're talking about the funding, that you are also actively looking at that and putting it on a statutory footing?
Yeah.
Because if we lose the sites, then we're in a difficult place. To have a barrier that's in the middle of the river and can't finish at the sides would be somewhat pointless, I think.
Absolutely. You'll recall that the Mayor lobbied certain authority councils to secure land when there was a preferred site. There are a number of options being looked at again, so once an option is settled on, absolutely we will be working with the EA again to make sure that's secured and available. So yeah.
Okay, and are there milestones attached to this work that is in progress apart from the publication in 2025?
I'd be happy to write to you and sort of give you an update of when we'll be doing the various bits of work. And just to flag, some of those bits of work are being led by other organisations, but we can set some of that.
Completely understand when you talk about ownership, it's fragmented. When you talk about dealing with the river, there's an awful lot. I mean, we actually did a trip as a committee, and we had representatives from a wide range of bodies all together in one place, including people from Scrutiny, and also from the operational side of the House. And it was, it's quite difficult, and that, of course, is one of the challenges of making these things move forward effectively. I'm sure the committee would be grateful to receive that. Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Richard. So your submission to the committee said that the Mayor and the GLA have already started engaging with the new government. What are the main priorities you asked for from them to support delivery against the 2030 net zero target, please?
Yeah, thank you, Assemblymember Prince. And it was good to meet up with you a few weeks ago to follow up on our committee meeting too. I think, look, for the first time, as I said, you've got a government who's not working against the Mayor of London, but equally who's as ambitious on climate change as we are here in London, as well as the local authorities. And, a key ask for us has been, we've just been speaking about retrofit. It's great to see the government's ambition really looking at thinking about how we can accelerate the retrofit revolution that we need, the lost decade of retrofit that we had in our city due to the lack of support from the previous government. So that's obviously been part of some of the conversations that we have been happening between GLA and government. And of course, local authorities will have their own conversations with government departments as they will be sort of looking into their retrofit offer in relation to that. The English devolution bill, which obviously was announced in the King's speech, government can unlock policy for, and particularly to think about how we can accelerate our ambitions to net zero around that. And we've been looking at a multi-financing package settlement for London to be able to do a lot of this work that we're talking about in terms of like resilience, in terms of what we're talking about renewables and the energy efficiency levels and the retrofit work that we need. We need to have a bit more strategic thinking and to have the funding package to be able to do that at a much more sort of strategic level to help us reach our 2030 target. So those are some of the conversations that we have been having, but what I would say is and also thinking about the governance processes. I know you spoke about the mission board in the previous session too, but also thinking about from a London perspective, how do we make sure that we're best aligned to the governance processes of also government to make sure that we're maximising some of the outcomes and the outputs that we want to see for Londoners and how we can reach our net zero ambitions.
Right, thank you. You've pretty much answered the next question I was going to ask you about. What representations has the Mayor made to government? I think you've sort of touched on that. You might want to be a bit more specific around what lobbying he's done in relation to the actual green industries in London. But also, how effective do you think the Mayor's lobbying will be in actually drawing out funds from this government, and is there any funding that's been agreed specifically targeted for green industries in London?
Well, what we've seen from the budget last week and just recently is obviously the announcement to support TfL in a much more comprehensive way than the previous government, which will hopefully obviously unlock money in terms of TfL's ambitions around resilience, but also around adaptation work in lots of areas that they can sort of do their bit to tackle the climate crisis. What we've obviously seen is there's a lot of announcements around, which are high level around retrofit and the Warmer Homes programme, the greening, the tree planting, and what we're currently doing from a GLA perspective is obviously having conversations with government to try to understand, what does this mean for London and how we can make sure that we're able to maximise the investment that we do get for London.
Just specifically on green industries, though, was any lobbying done for green industries?
I could say that at officer level we've participated in conversations about the industrial strategy and London's interests around both energy, clean energy, and also green finance, green professional services, etc. So we've been supplying information when requested by central government.
I think just to say as well, just on that point, and I think it's important for the committee to know this, part of the benefit, part of what we've been doing over the past 2 to 3 months has been basically just that point that Catherine's mentioned across all different areas, which is around partly because London's been leading the way in lots of the work, whether it's around sort of some of our heat zones, whether it's around thinking about, like our Green Finance Fund and the London Climate Facility. All of these different areas is basically providing government with as much as information as possible, where we've shown that, when you do take action, it can work. And if we do have further resources or the powers required, then we can even go further. So, it's that information supply that has been really important for us to be able to provide to the government, for them to understand how they can sort of obviously devise their plans as they move forward.
Thank you. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thanks, Chair, and welcome back to the committee. So nice to see you all. I think most of the questions are being covered by Assembly Member Prince, but just to focus perhaps first of all just on the devolution of powers that you'd be looking for from government.
Yeah, thank you, Assembly Member Mahfouz. As I said, one of the key things that the Mayor's been asking for is around outcome-based multi-year funding settlement financial package for London. So that will enable us to sort of hopefully take forward action in relation to, if you're thinking around, and when I'm talking about action as well, I think we've got to think about scale. Right, like when you talk about the ambitious targets that we do have, and that's what you were partly having the conversation with both Roseanne and with James, which is around, there's lots of good things happening. If we want to get to 2030 or these ambitious targets that we have, we've got to get to scale. So whether that's thinking about, the acceleration around energy efficiency, around solar PV sort of rollout around London, heat networks. I mean, I was just, me and Pete went to visit, and Catherine as well, all three of us went to visit the London Stadium last week, or the week before it was, and 3,200 solar membranes on the roof of the stadium, which is 6,500 square metres of space, but that's enough to power every event that's going to be happening at that stadium. And, you know, it's through the London Climate Finance Facility, the Green Finance Fund, that they were able to benefit from that, to be able to make that transition. So, you know, and those things are great, but it's basically the scale that we need. And so as part of the devolution conversation, what the Mayor's been very clear about is basically how we make sure that we have an outcome-based multi-year financing package. And obviously we've been relaying this to government.
And obviously at this point, the government's relatively new still, only been able to offer a one-year assessment to start off with, but the plan is to move away to 3-year assessment come next year. With that unlocks the opportunities to secure additional financial investment for infrastructure projects. Is there anything particular that you'd be looking for or have highlighted to the government that you want to see as part of that?
Yeah, I think just to also say the reason why those 3-year and sort of longer term finance packages really help is, you know, I come from, you know, having been a councillor for 10 years and trying to do things year by year, it's just you're not even scratching the surface in terms of what you're able to do, because you're just reactive rather than being proactive about thinking about, you know, you can have a climate action plan and pathways to sort of net zero 2030, but if you're not able to sort of financially able to sort of plan around what the strategic approach to that is, you're almost sort of like just running around sort of trying to take action, although it does obviously sort of help. So what you know, a key part of what I want to see for London is, you know, I'm very, it's very positive to see the Warmer Homes announcement around the £4.3 billion it is, and I think there's a massive opportunity for us to also, going back to that point that the chair was raising around how you have that conversation with Londoners, right? We've got to be able to get across the benefits that come with the transition. So if you're thinking about working class Londoners who live in social homes and being able to unlock, you know, money on scale that can really, you know, completely change our approach to retrofit and helping support their energy bills, creating the jobs, whilst at the same time we're helping meet our climate objectives and net zero objectives. That's the sort of ambition we need to do. So that's one of the things that I've been having with my conversations with Minister Miatta Fahnbulleh, but also with the Secretary of State, Ed Miliband too.
Fantastic. So, oh, sorry, go on, Catherine.
I was just going to say it was encouraging to see in the budget documents the reference to an integrated single settlement for London from 26-27 onwards, or that the government is committed to exploring that. So that gives us hope that what the Deputy Mayor described in terms of asking for that multi-year settlement, like the trailblazer authorities have had in West Midlands and Greater Manchester, that could be coming London's way as well. So we're making our case.
And the final thing that I would just say on this point as well is that I think it's also positive to see for the first time that London is no longer a dirty word for the government. You've already seen lots of positive announcements that are coming out, you know, be it the Oxford Street pedestrianisation, HS2 extension, like there are good things that are happening, which is going to hopefully transform the lives of Londoners whilst helping us also reach our environmental goals and objectives too. So I think, you know, we've got a government that, as I say, you know, is not only not working against us, but actually is actively working with us, doing that information sharing, understanding where we can get the quick wins, understanding where we can scale on some of our ambitions. And it's really positive in that in my first 2-3 months, I've really had so much engagement with, you know, ministers, but also officials.
No, it's incredibly positive, and obviously Assembly Member Cooper was asking earlier about that alignment politically, both at sort of local, regional and national level, and the impact of that is clearly evident from what you're saying there, Mette, so that's really good to hear. And the Mayor has talked about not being able to achieve net zero in London alone. At our last meeting, I think you heard Dr. Ashok Singla talking about actually not only the funding that we need to get from the public sector, but those comments that both yourself and Catherine have made earlier, with that long-term funding in place, means that we can unlock further private funding to go with that. I think it's been estimated that we're looking to secure about £75 billion of private sector investment that would be needed to help us meet net zero. So could you tell us a bit about the conversations that you've had with the private sector to start unlocking those funds?
If I may just clarify on the 75 billion private investment, that's 75 billion investment required. That's not all necessarily private investment. That's other sources too, just to clarify.
Yeah, so there's been a number of things that have happened over the past few months since I've come into my role. One of the things, obviously, is the conversation that we have with the private sector, specifically to understand, what is the framework that they need to be able to give them the confidence to be able to invest and understand where they could sort of like best target their resources, really recognizing that point that, if we are going to reach net zero, we do need to have that partnership working. And that is where most of the impact is going to be. So London Partners have been, as part of the London Growth Plan, have been having a series of roundtables focusing on climate tech, focusing on business engagement, and that's also positive to see the engagement that we're having with the Deputy Mayor for Business and Skills, which is around we've got to think about our net zero ambitions really at the heart of the London Growth Plan, and he really gets that, and that's why we've been organising those series of roundtables. So we've been collating the views of the private sector to understand, where can we've already had a very successful London Climate, the finance facility of £500 million of portfolio, whether it's around the MEF, the Energy Efficiency Fund, the Green Finance Fund, the Edge Fund, but it's really thinking about, okay, what more can we do to really unlock that? The other thing is, obviously, we launched the Zero Carbon Accelerator, and that's really important for us because that's around how do we make sure that we develop a pipeline of projects that can really be sort of investable for the private sector, and that can really unlock some of the ambitions that we want to sort of see. So there's a whole range of things that are happening, and there's also the engagement between, obviously, London councils and GLA, again, developing that pipeline of projects and hopefully being able to sort of bring forward the sort of private sector to be able to unlock that money that we need.
Really positive to hear that. I'm going to just go back to this point about not being able to achieve net zero alone, because obviously, we live on this planet with other people. London isn't an island on its own, and clearly there are global movements to move away, to start denying that climate change exists, or to put down the impacts that it has, or our ability to impact on it in terms of reducing it going forward. How do you anticipate that recent global events will impact on our ability in London to achieve the ambitious goals that we have?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I was saying that it wasn't a depressing day with the results in the US. We've now got someone who's in charge of the most powerful country in the world who's quite evidently a climate denier. But what I will say is that, when cities have always shown how we can lead the way, the mayor is the co-chair of the C40 network, which has already done some, astounding work when it comes to thinking about solutions that we need to really move forward on our net zero ambitions. And so, what happens in global events isn't going to affect us. We're very clear. The mayor's always been very clear about making sure that we're being very ambitious for London. And what we're going to be hopefully doing is just working with our partners and cities across the world, because London does have a huge role to play in making sure that we're doing our bit to bring about the benefits that people will see from the green transition, but at the same time being able to deliver on our obligation to hit the 1.5 degrees that we minimum need to be able to protect our communities and future generations from the impacts of climate change.
Well, I mean, now more than ever, I think we need that, that strong leadership, and clearly you've got yourself new in the role and keen to get to grips with the challenge at hand. We've obviously got a mayor who wants to make our city the greenest city, and so obviously he talks about his role as at the C40. What other roles do you think there are for yourself and for the mayor to achieve this ambition?
When I last came to this committee, I told all of you that I want to be the type of deputy mayor that gets around everywhere in our city and works with Londoners, really building on the work that I've done with young people before. I've been very busy over the past 3 months. I've done over 126 different engagements, official engagements in the first 100 days of me being deputy mayor. But the benefit of doing those engagements, Assemblymember Foose, is that the ideas that you hear from all of the different communities, the people that you meet, all of the businesses that you meet, and have got some incredible ideas, because we don't have all the answers. As much as we'd like to think that we've got all the answers, we don't have the answers. So there's a number of different, vehicles that I think we can use, help elevate to really think about how we could raise awareness on this issue and really bring the investment that we need. So I'm thinking, particularly the GLA's role, for example, in London Climate Action Week, and really thinking about how do we use that as a moment to really drive investment? How do we use that as a moment to think about the behaviour change work that we need to have and raise awareness around that. We obviously together went to the launch of the Circular Economy Week as part of Re-London. Re-London has a huge role to play, particularly with the Secretary of State, who is very passionate about circular economy and really thinking about how we align and further use Re-London to really help meet the Mayor's objectives around our sort of circular economy and all the jobs that can unlock. There's obviously the C40 network. There's a whole range of different things and vehicles that we can use. And, part of my job is basically making sure that, it's not always as us owning it. It's about how we can enable all of those different organisations and networks really to sort of accelerate to do that. Yesterday, we had at City Hall the Culture and Creativity Network through the European Office for Technology. And again, the conversation between the culture technologies, the storytelling that comes out of that. So there's all of these different networks that are part of it and that conversation. And, my job is, and obviously the team here at the GLA's role is to make sure that we enable them to go one step further.
Yeah, incredibly positive. I mean, if you could just tell us perhaps, Mette, one key takeaway that you got from your first 100 days in the role? Something is going to then be your key driver that perhaps you hadn't picked up before you took the job.
That's a very good question, and there's probably like a long list of things. But I think, the one thing that I would just say is, and I'd always been very passionate about the importance of having access to clean water and swimmable rivers, but also the quality issue of water quality. But I hadn't fully appreciated about, just how much it meant to Londoners. And over the past 100 days, when I've been going around, the amount of times that I meet working Londoners who've brought up the issue of having access to clean water and really making sure that we're protecting Londoners from the damage that's been caused by the water utility companies and making sure that they don't pay the price for their failures, I think is one of the key things that I've taken away, and that's why it's such a big focus. And the Mayor's been very clear, that in the second term, tackling air quality, we've cleaned our air. In the third term, it's about cleaning our waters.
Thank you very much for being concise with that.
Thank you very much. We also visited the London Stadium and the LLDC, or some of us did at least, and I do my fair bit of criticism about things generally, but the head of sustainability there gave a really, really good presentation, so I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that it felt really visionary. On the conversation we were just having, so Element Energy, the report, kind of had the pathways, but at the time, so if we take aviation again, for example, the Mayor was saying that, we shouldn't have a recovery from the pandemic that saw increased aviation, and now we know that horse has bolted. Aviation seems to be increasing, expanding to pre-pandemic levels, if not even more. Is it time to update that carbon pathway, and should it be an adopted strategy?
So I think the good thing that we've seen, firstly, I think aviation has a role to play in obviously doing its bit for meeting our climate change targets, and I think we need to be absolutely pushing them on that. And the Mayor's been very clear about the ambition that he sees for London. Obviously, when we also have the conversation about the future of airport expansions and all of that, I think the one good thing is also that we've seen is from government is the air passenger duty particularly on private jets, the 50% additional duty, which is obviously, hopefully, will have a big role to play as part of that. I don't know if Pete and Catherine wants to specifically come on sort of the pathways, specifically on the update.
Can I clarify my question to you, because I'm worried that the aviation was a red herring. So it's not even necessarily about aviation. My example there, though, is if you're not taking the carbon away from aviation, you've now got more carbon that you're emitting. So you're going to need to make more difficult decisions, like you're going to be talking about boilers in people's homes to heat pumps. So the whole thing has to balance, and this carbon pathway was from a few years ago. It's clearly not working anymore. Isn't it time for a new carbon pathway?
Sorry, can you repeat the last bit of the question? Sorry,
so if the assumptions that were made when that carbon pathway were made are now the wrong assumptions, no one's to blame for that, you can't predict the future. But to continue with that same pathway at this point would seem futile because City Airport, for instance, that looks like it's expanding, so there'll be more emissions there. So you're going to need to change emissions elsewhere. Is it time for a new pathway that recognises where we are now and looks to where we are at 2030, and that's adopted as a strategy to say this is a very clear carbon pathway to getting to net zero?
Yeah, so look, firstly, what I would say is on any expansion on the London City Airport, obviously, the Mayor made his views very clear about the role of expansions and obviously making sure that it's consistent with our environmental objectives, and obviously the government has also made that very clear too. I think in relation to our pathways and sort of across all the conversation that we've been having around London Environment Strategy, the pathways and all the different areas, I think we need to continuously be evolving and looking at updating these things as technologies and funding and regulatory frameworks do change. So I think, that's something that I'm happy to take away with the team, but
and would you like to see that as adopted as a strategy? So there's something official there where, for instance, the Secretary of State, if they're looking at planning recommendations, for instance, would be able to go, this is the adopted strategy of the London Mayor, to be able to look at how we're going to get to net zero?
Well, I'd be very cautious about committing us to something at this committee without obviously taking that further away with officers and obviously looking into that. What I will say is, what I've always said, Chair, is obviously we're focused very much on sort of delivery on this term. If there is anything we could do in that area to help us, accelerate on the pathway, then of course we will do that. But I'll take that away with officers and obviously.
Would you be able to write back to us with whether the carbon pathway should be an adopted strategy or not, or what advice you've taken on that?
Sure, I'd be happy to write back to you on that.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Sorry, Pete and Catherine, I don't know if you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just a small point on the aviation issue. So in terms of the net zero pathway, as we describe it in the plan for 2030, that is based on global protocols for how cities should report their emissions. So in fact, the aviation element is actually quite a small portion of our target as it's currently relayed, because it's kind of takeoff and landing from airports within the city to a height of 1,000 metres. Sorry to get very technical and boring.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so there is, I think there's a wider point you're making, but in terms of our pathway itself, actually that is a relatively small impact compared to road transport, for example, and other sectors. So not quite such an issue in terms of the actual 2030 pathway itself.
So I suppose this is why aviation is a red herring, and I should have found a better example because I'm talking about Scope 3 emissions there. But if we're talking about the other emissions, making sure that we've got a pathway that's current and up to date with the reality of what's happening in the change of government.
And so just again to add, so I think the work around the mandates and the delivery plans is very relevant here. So the plan has been published and there's been iterations and sort of we've adapted how we've gone about the meeting that sort of target from the LES. It was a 2050 target. We had the 2030 plan, and we're now going into an area where we're sort of focusing again on, with a new government, how do we most effectively sort of refocus? So part of that plan, I think, is about sort of articulating, identifying those opportunities again. They're broadly the same. The sort of rates we need, as Mette was saying, the rates we need are far, far greater, and I think that's the key sort of issue. So how do we align government, boroughs and others basically effectively to really genuinely scale up is the kind of key, because the sectors aren't changing. In terms of what we need to do, we know that it's just the scale of action we need is more the issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we're not given the aviation sector a pass. I think we need to be absolutely very clear about our expectations from them around sort of our environmental objectives, and I think that's what we'll do. But I think Pete's explanation around the Scope 1, 2 emissions and Scope 3, I think has been very helpful for this, but more than happy to come back to you on that.
Yeah, thank you, appreciated. On the mandates that Pete was just talking about, when do you anticipate we're going to see them? Because there's been lots of talks about those mandates, and I'm interested in something like waste, for instance, and its relationship with Re-London. They're going to be very obvious things that we as a scrutiny body will be able to assess your work and obviously more fundamentally the Mayor's work.
Yeah, so on the mandates, we don't have any sort of update in terms of when the sort of the announcements will be, and that will be made public. But I'm sure that in due course, when they are, it will be made available to the committee.
Do you think it's genuinely trying not to be overly confrontational about this, but as a scrutiny committee, it's really important that we're able to go, here's the essentially KPIs that we're assessing the mayor on with this. And the election was in May. Now, when it was in June or July, I totally accepted that there was a general election and that this was a new term and we were following the manifesto. But it does feel like we're getting quite late on in the day now, where we essentially are just having abstract conversations as opposed to these are the things that we are putting forward as elected by Londoners to deliver for you, and you're going to scrutinise us on these.
Yeah, look, I think, the mandates will be obviously made available to the committee and to the wide public in due course. What I would say, Chair, is obviously there are lots of our manifesto pledges. The Mayor's manifesto pledges were made public, and you can absolutely hold us to account on those manifesto pledges and when we think we're delivering for it. So that's also another route in how you can hold us to account. But I'm sure when the mandates are made public, you'll be sort of first to hear about it.
And the last time I heard the phrase in due course was when I asked for Mayor when he was going to elect a Deputy Mayor for Environment. You were elected that afternoon, I think. So in due course can sometimes be quite fast, or appointed, sorry. What is the relationship between the mandate delivery plans, the London-wide energy mission and the London Environment Strategy?
That's a great question, Chair. Thank you. So I think, what we're undertaking, we want to make sure that and I spoke about this earlier around how we make sure that we're able to maximise the relationship we have with government, but also local authorities. And it's about making sure that we've got the right governance processes around that. And we want to see, obviously, a London Energy Mission Board, which obviously mirrors the government's mission board, and there'll be other mission boards too, that will be consistent with the government's mission boards too. And the purpose of those would be obviously to make sure that we're able to maximise outcomes where we want to see around retrofitting all of our energy missions and the clean, like community energy, for example. That's the local power plan, the whole conversation around that. I'm very passionate about community energy and the role that the GLA can play in making sure that we reach 1,000 community energy projects. I announced the Community Energy Task Force in London, and we're going to be making further announcements around that very soon. But there's a big role for all of that work to kind of fit within those mission boards. Then there's the London Partnership Development Board, and the role that engagement I have with London councils in relation to that. So all of those things are intrinsically sort of linked and will hopefully help us get to a point in the next 4 years where we're able to really deliver at scale across all of the different sort of both climate and nature-based projects that we want to see across London.
Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts, I think you indicated you wanted to come in here.
Thank you. Yes, it's just touching on this business of a London-wide approach with the shared governance framework for net zero. It's going to require the buy-in of all London boroughs. Do you sense that buy-in is present at the moment? And is there a will to cooperate at such a scale?
Yes, I think the relationship between the GLA and London councils is as strong as it's ever been. Certainly through my sort of role and my portfolio, the engagement that we're having in conversations around, Catherine spoke about, retrofit and how we can help support councils around that agenda. I think what you can probably expect to see, and I think what's probably more I would say a better outcome from these relationships that we have is where we can sort of really focus our efforts across the different key projects and themes where we can. So the pipeline of project work, for example, that we're working around sort of the heat zones and the buildings and decarbonisation work. I think those are areas where we're able to maximise the relationships that we have with councils. So, yeah.
And if there isn't the coalition of the willing across the entirety of all 32 boroughs plus the city, do you think you might be willing to start looking at it on a sub-regional partnership level? So, find those people who are wanting to move quickly and speak to them first?
So I think that's a very good question, and I'm really glad you asked that, because I think that's relevant for two reasons. One is I think we need to be cracking on and doing things anyway with those who are willing to work with us, and also those who need support from us to help accelerate their work and make sure that we're sort of maximising the outcomes for them, for the boroughs. But secondly, I think when for example, we spoke about, in your previous panel, you spoke about the London surface water and, flood resilience. Some of that has to be thought about in sort of cluster regions, because obviously, we've got to think about, London as a whole as an action, but also there's going to be areas of action that we need where we need to sort of, cluster some of the boroughs and think about the regional action and thinking about the role that we have, whether it's around waste management and, the circular economy, for example, because some boroughs will have, it'll be cross-border and there'll be issues that will affect them much more closer. But also thinking about, for example, as I spoke about, obviously flood resilience, transport, for example, again, thinking about how we support outer London boroughs around, alternative methods of transport, and the mayor's obviously work around sort of the Superloop buses, for example. That's a very poignant conversation as part in relation to that. So I think, we do need to have a multi-layered approach, whether or not we have boroughs who are willing to work with us or not. I think both of those things need to happen simultaneously. We need to be thinking about a London-wide approach, bringing as many councils on board as possible. And that's part of my job is making sure that I'm out there and actually listening to borough leaders, and that's partly what I've been doing. But then also partly it's around making sure that, where there are specific geographical areas of London where there are issues sort of very relevant to that area, then I think we need to think about the role we have in terms of bringing some of those boroughs together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Assemblymember McCartney.
Yes, thank you. I want to ask about just transition and engagement with the public, and the Mayor's response to the London Sustainable Development Commission's Just Transition report committed to exploring where there might be opportunities to crystallise a London-wide just transition vision. And I noticed in March this year you approved funding for research into the most effective models for engagement, and we're going to do some further work on that. So I'm just really asking, what opportunities have you identified for this London-wide vision and the messaging you would do around it?
That's a great question, Assemblymember McCartney, and I think so there's a number of things in this area and why I'm so passionate about engagement, because I think when you do engagement, I think you've also got to be really clear that you deliver on the engagement that you do with Londoners. The most counterproductive thing you can do is try to engage Londoners on an issue and you don't really have the feedback loop of going back to them and saying, here's what we spoke about and here's actually how we can make that difference. I had the opportunity to meet with the LSDC chair where we spoke about the vision and the mission of London's mission to sort of tackle the climate crisis, and the LSDC has played a huge role in relation to sort of to doing that. But what I'm also very interested in doing is thinking about our engagement strategy in relation to sort of the delivery of specific manifesto pledges. So you take, for example, the Green Roots Fund that that's in the manifesto, which is around increasing access for green space and for nature for black and global majority groups, women-led, youth-led groups, for example. What role do those groups who don't have access to green space or nature have in shaping that fund that we're going to go out to Londoners with? And that's why we convened the young people around as an initial step to really understand their priorities. And that's what I've tasked the team with is really thinking about the engagement model and the engagement strategy specifically around that delivery of that manifesto pledge. The other key example I can give you is the Future Neighbourhoods programme that we have for 2030. I went to visit North Kensington, where we supported, I think it's £500,000, wasn't it, that we funded through the GLA, and just seeing the co-production, co-design on the implementation of that funding that we put there, it really empowered the communities to really take action. And because they basically, the money for us that we were giving to them was really thinking about how we enable them to make it much more sustainable in the long term. So I went to visit a playground, for example, where all of the materials in the playground was made out of sustainable products. The youth club, Harrow Youth Club, for example, and the work that they were doing there around the sort of creating access to green space in the garden space. We also visited this space, which is all around the circular economy, all Moroccan and North African women, specifically supporting people from the communities around, the reuse of goods and services in the area. So I think, what I'm very interested in is, and those are very good examples of, how you engage Londoners and how you see the outcomes for it. I think what would be bad is basically it's like engaging people in a room at a very high level, and it's not so clear where the outcomes of those conversations are going, because that's where you lose people, and people will be like, great, Deputy Mayor, you invited me to this event or to this part of this conversation, but what's come out of it, and then they'll never participate again. And there's some really good examples again across London. I know when I was a cabinet member in Hackney, I commissioned a citizens jury on how we respond to extreme heat. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is what we're very interested in terms of our engagement strategy is how we engage citizens around specific delivery of policy, manifesto policies, and the work that we're doing.
Okay, so what I've got it right is that there's no set policy as to which engagement method is correct, but you're going to be engaging and hopefully co-designing with many of these projects. But can I ask, yes, sure. Yeah. Please, but can I ask as well, but when we talk about creating a vision, an overarching strategy, an engagement that you're going to be working to, has there been engagement done on that already, or will there be?
Yeah, happy to come in quickly. I mean, as Mete's outlined, the good thing here is we don't start from scratch. You know, we've done a number of things over a long period of time. You all know, of course, social justice, climate justice. The Mayor talks about them together. But you know, just some examples. Mete mentioned the Future Neighbourhoods, where we've funded 12 boroughs to work with their communities to really build those routes to 2030 bottom up and get that sort of buy-in, which is incredibly important. Second, I'd just say in terms of the manifesto committee commitment around clean and healthy rivers, that is focused again on making sure everybody can access you know, good quality river-sized waterways over the next sort of 10 years. So I think that's a good practical example of this being about everybody rather than, you know, just focused on a few people in the city. And then finally, we have, you know, the climate vulnerability maps, where we have sort of mapped particular environmental risks, such as heat, flooding, poor air quality in the city, access to green space, against social deprivation indicators, and we've used that in many of our programs to identify where we can target most effectively. So some of our green infrastructure programs, for example, have done that. The Future Neighbourhoods program is an example where we use that as a criteria to make sure we are targeting our limited resources where they can be most impactful. You referred to the piece of work underway, and of course that's the next step, is to think about, through these delivery plans, how we take forward you know, engagement, again, as Mete is sort of describing, but that cuts across a number of things which we're thinking through at the moment, from, you know, education, public awareness, training, public participation, access to information, international cooperation. There's a whole range of things that are in scope there and in the thinking, which we are working our way through with obviously the Mayor's office and others at the moment.
And what's really important as part of that as well is not just thinking about what we're doing across our sort of directorates, but actually it's thinking about how it also fits part of across the GLA as well. So how does these visions sort of interact with the work that's happening across the GLA? So I spoke about the London Growth Plan. So how is this just transition, that framework, the vision around sort of our ambitions around climate change is really embedded as part of that, because that's what we need. Essentially what you need is you need me, Catherine and Pete to not be in the room saying, hey, have you thought about our ambitions on climate change? You need people to already be embedded in it, and that's why we've obviously got the Climate Equalities tool, which is there to help support teams and staff across the GLA to make sure that they're really embedding the thought of how they can, you know, that it's consistent with our pathways and what our ambitions are. But also it's thinking about, for example, the climate literacy training. I actually done my GLA climate literacy training on Friday. It was great. And it's like, you know, I learned so much. And it was also great to speak to all of the people on the course too, across the different teams from the GLA being there, seeing how much they learned, all the conversation and the pledges that we could take, both personally but also as staff members, to make sure that we're helping reach. So I think, you know, these are all things that we need to really embed across the organisation, so that, you know, when Justine, the Deputy Mayor for Culture and for Creativity, is out there speaking to the culture sector, she's speaking about our vision. When Howard's out there talking about the London Growth Plan, he's doing that. When Debbie's out there talking to the communities and social justice element, she's doing that. Everyone is doing it, and it's meant to be seamless. And I think, you know, we've still got some way to get there, but that's partly my job, is basically making sure that I'm working across the GLA and making sure we've got that consistent vision for all of us to follow.
Thank you. Perhaps I can then ask Catherine, is there going to be a London-wide vision that you know, document we can look at, say this is what the Mayor wants to do, this is what the vision is, and then will there be perhaps a London strategy to accompany that?
So I think that's a question for which we're discussing with the Deputy Mayor at the moment about what the right communications and engagement plan is for the GLA on climate change and environment topics more generally. I'd say that on the just transition, what we've tended to hear, particularly as we've spoken to councils and public bodies and kind of community groups, is that they really want practical advice. They can sometimes find the sort of highfalutin rhetoric a bit off-putting, and they sort of agree with it, but they want to know what they can do in practice. They want case studies of other organisations. So we have been doing that, sharing examples of good integration of just transition and equalities concepts into policy design, programme design, etc. Thanks.
Okay, and Mette, you talked earlier about having used you called it a citizens' jury. I think others call it citizens' panel. Do you envisage having something that's going to regularly, like a standing panel, if you like, that can regularly give you feedback or not?
There was a really good, I actually wrote it down, there was a really good comment that James had made in the last panel where he spoke about I think he spoke about the importance of citizens informing and politicians leading. And I think that's exactly what we intend to do, which is basically thinking about how citizens can help inform everything that we do around our climate ambitions. And I'm really, really interested in looking at how we embed that into the project planning process. I think that's the key thing here, is that you need to really embed participation as part of project development and policy development. So that's why what I'm very interested in is the engagement strategies that we're having separately in relation to our Green Routes commitment, separately in relation to our commitment around net zero schools, separately in relation to what we're doing around air quality and reaching the WHO guidelines by 2030. So we need to be having these conversations separately as opposed to sort of course, you know, there's a role for Londoners to play in part of our broader conversation. But the reality is as well, we know the strategies. Londoners, what they expect from us is action. You know, they've elected the mayor on his third term, and you know they want us to take action. So I think, you know, we need to really think about citizen engagement in relation to development of policy in relation to specific areas. And I think it's also powerful. Like if I went to an event, you know, I remember when I was you know, I always talk about my story. Like my youth club got shut down when I was 15, and that's what got me very political. And it was one of the key things that I found very, very empowering. Was the first time where actually Assembly member Jeanette Arnold, when she was the chair of the London Assembly in 2008, and I was just turning 16, I remember she'd sort of convene this conversation around what we could do around youth services, because she was the Assembly member for North East and the Hackney region, and she brought together all the key partners from the council, from the community, and she brought basically us to the table as young people. And it was a very clear outcome-based conversation where I remember on the back of that, we then basically had access to, for example, going to different youth centre provisions elsewhere. So I came away from that thinking, oh, wow, like someone actually brought me to the table, listened to what I said, and here I saw what the outcome of that conversation was. What would have been counterproductive was a young, angry Mette, very angry about the youth club being shut down, politician coming and saying, oh, Mette, let me talk to you about this issue that you care about, and getting you to speak for like half an hour, 45 minutes, complete waste of time because I haven't seen what's come out of it. And then the next time someone asks me to participate in something, I'll be like, forget it, I don't want to do it, because I remember that time when that person invited me. So I think what I've asked the team to do is just being very clear about where we do have engagement. There are clear outcomes that we could feedback loop to the people that we're engaging with. Otherwise, it just feels a disconnect.
Sounds positive. Thank you.
Thank you. When I was first elected, actually, last term, I was pushing for something called the London Climate Panel, and it sounds like you're coming up with something similar, actually, which is a group of engaged people, particularly from marginalised or underrepresented groups, who could be on a panel who could advise, whether it's probably you or the mayor, at a regular interval, and I agree, make it outcome perceived. My only thing I'd kind of really encourage if you're going down this route is that we pay people for the time and effort, because if we make it a free volunteer thing, then we'll have lots of people who come who go to lots of those things, and their contribution is really welcome. But I think it locks loads of people out. Anyway, I won't ask you about it because I realise it's a question of funding, but I guess I'm just making a plea that if you are fighting for your bit of a budget...
That's a great point.
I think a climate panel would be great.
Yeah.
Last time you were in front of the committee, you stated that you were finding ways of engaging young people, particularly through your previous work at your current work as well, sorry, at My Life, My Say. What ideas are you exploring in how to engage young people?
yeah, this is an area that I'm very passionate about. It's around how you think about not just for young people, black and global majority groups. I think class is important in this conversation. Women-led groups that are typically excluded from the conversation around the benefits of the green transition. And, you know, we've got a number of different, as I say, like manifesto commitments, be it around the Green Roots Fund. So what we had around that was we had the youth engagement session with young people. We want to see that continue, and that's something that the team is working on as we help develop the Green Root Fund. Just imagine how powerful it would be, right, where you've got a fund in London that's there to achieve the mayor's mission of creating access to green space and for nature to flourish across the city, but it was co-produced and co-designed with a group of young people who can then say, hey, by the way, this big thing that's now making a big change across London, I've had a role to play in it. So I've asked the team to think about that across everything that we're doing. But there's also a conversation about what you just spoke about, which is, you know, if you're thinking about our broader mission and vision, you know, what role do young people meet? And I've been very lucky to host lots of inspiring climate activists in City Hall. Clover Hogan, who's one of the most inspiring youth climate activists that I've worked with through my time at Wildlife Marseille, you know, very well respected across the globe for her work on this work. And, you know, part of the conversation I've been having with her is saying, look, like, tell me, what is it that we can do that can create a framework for you and others to come into the space and actually, like, help us to help you, basically, right? It's about working with people and hearing their ideas. So speaking to like people like Clover Hogan, Earthrise, Isabella Noero, for example, and the team there's like really inspiring youth activists across London. You know, I met with Live and Breathe, who does a lot of work in Peckham as well around air quality. So there's so many inspiring people, and the thing is, they've already got the answers, or they know how to best engage. What we need to do from a mayor's office and from GLA is basically create a platform for them to be able to do that in a way where, you know, I've spent my whole life basically saying, imagine, like, as I said, like earlier on when I was talking, I spent my whole life saying, oh God, if only I was in a position where I can actually make a difference. And now I'm in a position where I can as a deputy mayor. And part of my job is just making sure that I'm able to pass the ladder back down to those from the communities that are most impacted, and for them to lead the change that we need to see.
That's really great to hear. And if I'm giving more unsolicited advice, the London Housing Panel, I think, is a really good model for this too, just to take that model and go, let's do this for climate and environment. Finally, from me for a moment, have you considered, or has the GLA considered opportunities to undertake participatory budgeting to find out ways of prioritising funding for net zero?
So, has the GLA considered participatory budgeting?
Yeah, that's essentially the question.
That is a good question. I actually don't have the answer to, but I think Catherine may want to come in if we've done that in the past.
Yeah, thanks. So Pete's shaking his head at me here. So I'm just going to read from my briefing because I have to say I wasn't involved in this, but I understand that our regeneration team has worked on this, particularly Crowdfund London, which raised £6 million through 25,000 Londoners donating money for projects in the city. And so that was about fostering participation, community cohesion, and then some of the projects that they backed included things which were relevant for the environment, so parks, gardens, teaching communities about nature, sustainable food growing, etc. So there is some experience, I don't think in the Environment and Energy Unit recently, but other parts of the GLA have done this.
Thank you. And in the spirit of being completely non-partisan, I think Len Duval's pushed for this in the past, not necessarily in environment, but participatory budgeting across the Assembly. I know he certainly submitted questions about it anyway. And back to Assemblymember McCartney.
I do, yes. Thank you. Yeah. It's a little bit follows on for what Zach's saying about just transition, and those that are impacted might be least able to afford or to participate. And so I'm going to ask you about how is the new Equalities and Climate Impact tool affecting how you make policy?
Yeah, and that conversation is really important. Before I do answer the question, I just do want to make that point, because I think often, and it goes back to what you were saying, Chair, in the previous panel, which is around, like, I think often when we do talk about climate change, it can really feel overburdening for a lot of people. And I often get people always saying to me, you know, Mete, I'm the little man in the room, go pick on the big, like, fossil fuel companies. And they've got point, right? Like, you know, we need to make sure that the transition is not seen as a downgrade or less better version of what you had before. It needs to be seen as, like, fundamentally, this is much better as we move forward. And actually, I think that we're not just doing this because we have to, because otherwise none of us will be sitting here having a conversation because the world is ending. We're actually doing this because fundamentally our lives are much better with a green transition. The fact that, you know, like, if you live in an area in London where you don't have access to green space and you don't have the choice to move because you live in social housing, so it's down to the council to where you live, the fact that we can create much more thriving neighbourhoods, making sure it's flood resilient, the fact that we're able to create the new green skills of tomorrow, which is going to be much more sustainable jobs, the fact that we're going to help support some of our most vulnerable residents around their energy bills. These are all things that we should be aspiring to do, regardless of the conversation around sort of resilience and how we protect future generations. So I think, you know, it's really important that we do think about the engagement and the vision and the mission around that, but also coming in, sort of speaking internally. You know, I've been very clear, again, like, you know, for the work we've been doing with Pete and Catherine, is about how do we make sure that we make sure the GLA is most equipped to be able to, when making decisions, just like we consider, for example, finance legal decisions across all of our policy areas, but also thinking about the impact of climate. And that's why, obviously, the Climate Inequalities tool is really important. That's obviously being rolled out. That is backed up by the climate literacy training that we want to see rolled out. Hopefully, you know, I'd love to, I don't know how many of you have actually done the training as well, but I'd really encourage you to do the training. It's honestly, it's such a fun day. They've got an incredible, and it's also a train-the-trainer model, right? So we encourage people from across the GLA. So it's not just the environment team.
So we can have a session with you shortly.
Yeah, maybe I could deliver it, yeah. So you can sign up to actually train people. And so my trainer was not necessarily from the environment and energy team, which I thought was really powerful, because then it's really empowering, and that's where you see the big change. So I think that's what we need to get to. We need to get to a point where essentially it's not the environment committee or the deputy mayor for environment and energy or the environment and energy team who's talking about this. It's basically everyone in the GLA is thinking right from the outset, does this work? Before I even start working on what I'm going to work on, does it really fit in line with our ambition on climate change? And if it doesn't, then you shouldn't be pursuing it.
And perhaps I could ask Catherine or Pete, have you got an example where that's had a discernible impact on what you've decided to do?
Yes, so I was asking the team about this, and I was really interested to hear, for example, that MOPAC, as they were coming up with their domestic abuse safe accommodation strategy, had used the tool and looked at the premises and the transport that was used and kind of run that through that climate considerations. What does this mean for emissions? And I really like that example, because it's not an energy project, it's not a parks and nature project. It's something that you wouldn't necessarily think was related to climate, but they'd managed to use the tool for that.
Yeah, if I may just add as well. So Mette mentioned the climate literacy tool and the equalities tool. They do go hand in hand. So we've been sort of soft testing the tool as we start to build up the numbers on the climate literacy, and it's just a cheeky request in particular to male assembly members. I see the numbers of people signing up at the moment, and women at the GLA are basically participating much more at the moment than men. So I'm pushing as hard as I can to just encourage us to be much more active and involved as well, along with our female colleagues. So just to encourage all of you, of course, but in particular, it'd be great to see, more men setting an example across the organisation too.
And Pete, whilst you're there, who's monitoring it, the implementation of it and its impact? Is that your team?
Yes, that's our team. Okay. Yeah. So both are quite an early stage, but again, we'd be happy to give you more information as that starts to roll out.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Just
Thank you.
In sort of September.
Thanks.
I'd be really up for that training, and I think the Budget and Performance Committee potentially, but obviously I can't commit them to it, but I think that'd be really interesting, particularly around climate budgeting. Assembly Member Tyrrell.
Thank you, Chair. These questions are directed to Mette, so good afternoon. So we heard on the first panel about the fact that the journey to net zero is going to require people to come along with the journey with us, not to be dragged along. In the submission to this committee received from the Friends of the Earth, it highlighted ULEZ as an example where, I quote, more inclusivity is needed to build a stronger consensus. So could I ask what lessons have been learned from the implementing of politically contentious policies, and how are you tailoring engagement with different groups?
Yeah, great question. I think I want to start by saying, which I think is really important to make this point, that there's a myth out there that green policies don't win elections. And I think actually what you see is green policies do win elections, and that's why the mayor was elected on his historic third term with an increased majority from his second term to third term, because of the ambition he's shown on air quality and on ULEZ. ULEZ was not an easy decision to take, but the mayor, and rightly so, said that he wants to make sure that tackling toxic air pollution is really at the heart of his mayoralty, and protecting the lungs of children is at the heart of his mayoralty. We know from reports, and Pete and Catherine can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in terms of making sure that London's air quality legal limits, he's brought it forward.
If I may, Deputy Mayor, well, I'm not looking to reopen the debate about ULEZ. I think that's settled. I think the question is about lessons that have been learnt about the way ULEZ was implemented, to make sure that when we introduce other green policies that may be contentious, that the lessons have been learnt from the process.
Sure, look, I think, you know, the important thing to say is that everything we're delivering in London is through the mandate that the mayor's got from the election that saw him be elected for a historic third term. So we're enacting the wish of Londoners. We want to work with Londoners. Of course, every project that we undertake across the GLA, we have to make sure that we do take learning around sort of the evaluation, you know, the participation of residents. And that's something that we'll be continuously doing, and it really just builds on the whole conversation we've been having for the last hour, which is around how do we make sure that citizens are really shaped at the heart of that. Of course, there'll be learnings from previous projects that we've done, but I think we're only here, enacting the wishes of Londoners who elected the mayor on his historic third term.
Thank you for that. So you said previously in your introductory meeting with us that all the recommendations in the climate resilience review were of equal priority to you. Have you since re-evaluated the priorities of these, and will you be expediting those relating to achieving net zero by 2030?
So there are some priorities that we've seen already progress on, haven't we, with the European funding, what's it called?
Sure. So we've had funding from the Europe Horizon project, so that's £200,000, which is helping
to resilience.
Yeah. So that's over the course of the next year is going to be helping us understand how we become more resilient in London. We also ran Operation Helios directly when the resilience review was published, which was bringing together lots of different partner agencies to think about what if heat got beyond 40 degrees in London and how would we all respond. So we've really ticked some of them off. But Peter, I don't know if you want to come in, your team leads on this.
Yeah, there's a number we've been kind of taking forward. So the green finance work, there were recommendations there around thinking about how we effectively finance adaptation and greening work as well. So there is work underway, which is sort of looking at the potential role of green finance. The London Climate Finance Facility could play there. Again, we introduced into the climate budget climate adaptation, and I see the next year and the year after as really important steps to really improve what we currently report as a group and get a really good baseline, a bit like we now have on net zero 2030. So in terms of prioritisation, you'll hear more about that, of course, when we get through the delivery plans, because that's where that's going to be set out a bit more clearly.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing is obviously these are all being fleshed out through the delivery plans. We've obviously been having lots of engagement with government around it, particularly around our plans around waterways and resilience. There's obviously the wider GLA family like TfL and the role that they could play. I've actually had the opportunity to engage with Emma Howard-Boyd quite a few times since it's obviously very thankfully and gratefully have delivered such an important review for us in London, and it's also working with Emma and others to make sure that we're able to enact on those recommendations. But as Pete said, obviously as the delivery plans are sort of coming to shape and obviously that's made available, you'll start to see what the actions are that has been prioritised.
Thank you very much, and finally Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. COP29 is coming up in a few days, 4 days, I think. Azerbaijan, Baku, Azerbaijan. What contribution will the Mayor be making to COP29, if any?
So, neither the Mayor nor myself plan to attend COP29, nor any GLA officers, I believe. Our engagement through COP29 will be primarily through the C40 network, where obviously the mayor is the co-chair, and there's a whole, C40 will be present there, and it will have a series of asks, and so we feed into that process. So we would, in this case, C40 will be, acting sort of some of the demands from across all the cities, including London. Our focus right now is primarily focusing on our relationship with the government. Mayor's been very clear to me since I started my job, is to make sure that, over the next 6 to 12 months, we really maximise the engagement with government and get in as much as we can for London. So right now we're focused on London and the UK.
Thank you very much. I can't see any other Oh, sorry, Catherine.
It's quite all right. Just about COP29. Some of the London Sustainable Development Commissioners will be attending COP29, I think in their individual capacities rather than as LSDC representatives, but they've offered to come and report back to Assembly members if you find it useful. They're attending sessions on urban decarbonisation and what cities can do.
That'd be really helpful to know, and a briefing could be really interesting. So thanks for passing that on. Thank you to all three of you for coming and answering our questions. We've got a few more items of business to attend to, as you know, so feel free to leave the chamber or hang out with us if you wish. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Agreed. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for 4th of December 2024 at 2 p.m, potentially in committee rooms 2 and 3 City Hall. I have no more urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you.